Hi everyone, my name is JP and welcome back to the Studio 515 lecture series. This is our Vivaldi lecture, which will lead into a subsequent discussion about Spring from the Four Seasons, which is one of the RCM mandated pieces for this Baroque module. Now, Antonio Vivaldi was born in Venice in the year 1678 and he died at the age of 63 in 1741. Now, looking back at our timeline, we can see that Vivaldi falls quite neatly into the middle of this Baroque period. While 1600 is an approximation of the beginning of the Baroque era, Vivaldi was operating well within it. Now, Vivaldi's father, Giovanni Battista, was a professional violinist, and Giovanni taught his son this skill. Now, at a fairly young age, Vivaldi, Antonio that is, began to study composition with Giovanni Legrenzi, the Maestro di Cappella, or the choir master of St. Mark's Basilica. There's a lot of Giovannis during this period. Now, at the age of 15, Vivaldi began to study to become a Catholic priest, and 10 years later, when he was 25 years old, he was ordained. Now, because of his red hair, Antonio was nicknamed the Red Priest. Interestingly enough, however, it's said that Vivaldi did not celebrate many masses during his entire lifetime because of his extremely poor health. From childhood, he was an asthmatic, and while this didn't stop him from being a musician, it did mean that he was more or less unable to play wind instruments. As a priest, Vivaldi had the bad habit of dropping everything while saying Mass in order to start composing. Now, it's believed that these factors resulted in Vivaldi receiving a dispensation in 1704 from the otherwise standard requirement for priests to celebrate Mass. Vivaldi was also known as an extremely talented violinist. This becomes clear in his compositions, a great deal of which are clearly idiomatic to the violin and require great deals of virtuosity in order to pull off these quick passages, these arpeggiating figures and double stops. Now, idiomatic writing is another one of these RCM required definitions for which they don't give any keywords or phrases. So we're going to head over to the New Oxford American Dictionary again for some help. The dictionary gives us a couple definitions, neither of which are really right on the money for our purposes. The first definition is using, containing, or denoting expressions that are natural to a native speaker. The second is appropriate to the style of art or music associated with a particular period, individual, or group. What does all that mean? Well, certain things work better on some instruments than they do on others. On the violin, for example, from the lowest to the highest, the strings are G, D, A, and E. If you count, that means each of the strings are set exactly a perfect fifth apart from one another. This, therefore, makes it very easy for violinists to play passages exploiting this built-in inclination towards perfect fifths. For another instrument, say a clarinet, or something bouncing back and forth between an A and an E really quickly might not be as straightforward as it would be to a violinist. Not because of lack of talent or ability, but because a violin is set up in a way that a clarinet is not. Composers, therefore, who exploit the natural inclinations of an instrument are writing in a manner idiomatic to that instrument. So, what's our definition going to be? I'd suggest something like this. Idiomatic writing is writing which utilizes techniques which are appropriate to the natural abilities born by the particular instrument for which a piece is being written. Yeah, that's a lot of words. To say it another way, idiomatic writing is that kind of composition, that kind of writing that is written with a particular instrument and the physiology required to play that instrument in mind. You can come up with your own thing, and sure, this definition I'm offering doesn't really encapsulate the whole gamut of meanings that idiomatic might bear, but I do think that it serves the purpose that the RCM is seeking here. In 1703, at just 25 years old, Vivaldi becomes the master of violin at the Pio Ospedale della Pietà, or the Devout Hospital of Mercy. This hospital was really a Venetian orphanage for girls, and Vivaldi spent his next 30 or so years there. In 1716, he became the outright director of music for the school. This orphanage was unique in that it was basically a music conservatory, which was famed throughout Europe. The girls who lived there became fantastic musicians, and a lot of Vivaldi's compositions were written specifically for this group of young musicians. Though his educational role at the orphanage was, for lack of a better word, a job, being a priest and a dedicated musician, it's by no means too great a leap of reasoning to assume that his work with the girls in this orphanage conservatory was altruistic in at least some sense. Now, the sheer amount of compositorial output that Vivaldi had just borders on absurd. He wrote over 40 operas, including Orlando Furiosa and Griselda, a whole ton of sacred music, including an oratorio called Juditha Triumphans, motets, and a setting of the Gloria from the Catholic Mass. But we're mostly focused on the just ridiculous number of concertos that Vivaldi wrote, which is over 500. Now, a concerto, for those of you who don't know, is a popular instrumental genre of the Baroque era for soloist or group of soloists, an orchestra intended to showcase the virtuosity of that singular soloist or group of soloists. Concerto is generally written in 3 movements, fast, slow, and fast, which frequently employs this structural form called ritornello form. This 3-movement form was attributable in great part, though not exclusively, to Vivaldi's vast efforts in the concerto genre. I'll just quickly note that a concerto with a single soloist is called, kind of obviously, a solo concerto. And a concerto with a group of soloists is called a concerto grosso, and that group is called a concertino. That group of soloists within the concerto is called a concertino. This is just some good information for you to back pocket. It could add some value to your exam if it comes up at all. Okay, so to repeat, a concerto is a popular instrumental genre of the Baroque era for soloists or soloists, an orchestra intended to showcase the virtuosity of that soloist or group of soloists. A concerto is generally written in 3 movements. First is fast, second is slow, and the third and final movement is also fast, which frequently employs ritornello form on those book-ending movements, the first and the third. So what's ritornello form? Ritornello form is a structure employed in the first and third movements of the Baroque concerto, like I said, in which the opening passage, also called the ritornello, is restated throughout the movement. It serves as a refrain. It's sort of a call and response type of thing where the call stays the same, or at least it's very, very similar, and the response to that call varies. You'll hear this very clearly when we discuss Spring from the Four Seasons in our next lecture. The call, the ritornello, is unmistakable against the interludes that rise up throughout the movement. Now, Vivaldi was a very important figure in the establishment of this structural form, which makes sense since he wrote over 500 of these things. You write that much and you're pretty much bound to be considered a major influencer. Vivaldi became an incredibly famous musician and composer. He was renowned throughout Europe and eventually received commissions by various royalty and significant government officials. However, as the musical tastes of the West began to evolve, moving fairly quickly towards the classical era, Vivaldi's music was no longer in nearly as high demand as it used to be. Near the end of his life, it would appear that Vivaldi took a job working as a composer for Emperor Charles VI and therefore moved to Vienna. But upon Vivaldi's arrival, the emperor died and Vivaldi lacked patronage. Not long after this, Vivaldi died destitute and was buried in a public hospital cemetery and was largely forgotten and for centuries. However, Vivaldi's legacy was not to be denied, and there was a sudden resurgence in his popularity and various academic scholarship focusing upon him in the 20th century, and is now, as you know, undoubtedly one of classical music's most beloved figures and properly recognized for his importance and influence. Thanks for listening to this lecture on Antonio Vivaldi, and please check out the link in the description for this slide deck. Head over to studio515.ca to get more tips and tricks about exam writing and to see this whole course laid out neatly. Our next lecture is about Spring from the Four Seasons, and I've added a couple links in the description to this video for you to listen to, just so that you know what's going on when we begin to analyze the piece. One of the links is going to be to a recording with a score, so that you can follow along as the piece plays, and another is to a live recording. Thank you.